We are very pleased to welcome Professor Babette Babich from New York Fordham University. Babette Babich is one of the great Nietzsche and Heidegger scholars in the world. She's the editor of the new Nietzsche Studies Review and has published an astronomical number of papers about both Heidegger and Nietzsche, aesthetics, sciences, and multiple other topics. Her large view allows her to trespass the limits that are more and more imposed to academic philosophy. On this topic, Babette Babich has been a very vocal critic of the global expansion of the analytic philosophy. From her point of view, this global tendency amounts to standardization, a kind of fetishist imposition of technical norms and habits to philosophy, to make it look like science, even if it is not science. From the analytical philosophy point of view, where many of us were or are trained in Geneva, this is disturbing. But Babette Babich has been first educated in biology and then turned to philosophy of science, so she can't be accused of ignoring the material and causal determination of our world. On the contrary, but she is primarily interested, as phenomenology puts it, in the way things appear to us. One deep concern for her, shared with Nietzsche and Heidegger, is the risk for the philosopher to presuppose a so-called objective reality, because this presupposition could block the access to the primary way that things appear to us. The primacy of a more originary and subtle reality over the scientific objectival reality, and the pretension of the continental philosopher to speak of it, is something very difficult to consider for the analytic positivist side. This is one of the disputed points in the almost impossible debate between, on one side, continental philosophers, largely inspired by Heidegger, and on the other side, the analytic or positivist philosophers. The analytics accuse the continentals of talking of something that doesn't exist or that philosophy cannot consider, while the continentals say that the analytics are missing the very point of philosophy. The topic of the conference has slightly shifted. From hermeneutic phenomenology and science, we went to necropolitics and Techno-Scotosis, or say it in a more friendly fashion, necropolitics, politic of death, and techno-blindness. I can foresee in this title the very essence of the conflict between analytics or positivist and continentals I just described. Continentals accuse analytics of blindness, while analytics say continentals are hallucinating. Here comes the fear of the technological domination that we tried to illustrate with the eye of the bad computer HAL. Our poster is still valid. Techno-scepticism is rife in science fiction and in what is called continental philosophy, like in Heidegger or Jean Baudrillard or Michel Foucault. It is absent in the positivist philosophy. For a long time, Baudrillard or Heidegger's apocalyptical vision of technoscience has been considered as fictional theory. But recently, with the recession of progress, it looks more serious. And now, by this extraordinary situation we are in, it looks very much like a dystopic anticipation movie. And I think Babette is going to talk also of this. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Babette Babich and eager to hear her lecture about necropolitics and Techno-Scotosis or technical blindness. Babette, this is your turn.
Yes, yes. Thank you very, very much, Nicolas, because this was a very comprehensive and the wonderful kind of introduction that almost makes the points to be made in the text to follow irrelevant. So I'm going to proceed anyway. We'll at least have pictures, and hopefully we'll just go over some of the wonderful ground that you have already articulated for us. I will be speaking in English, but it is true that although I speak French with a little bit of a slowness, I understand it and I can speak it. It's just you will get bored while I'm making my sentence. I can do that in English too, but usually I'm much faster. I will try to maintain a particular pace. I'm also going to share a slide, because by using slides, we can maybe bridge the linguistic gap in some other way. So I'm going to start to do that. I think I can. You should see a slide which says what is also behind me. Is this true? Do you see a screen?
We see it.
Absolutely fantastic. Okay, so this is the poster. This is what Nicolas was talking about. This is his design. It's gorgeous. It's a wonderful design, and it's a tiny change, just a very small one, to change to the actual title. They are very related on Necro-Politics and Techno-Scotosis. But one of the things that should also be mentioned is that I do have 2 books in French. I regret very much that I wrote this book, because it's impossible to get the precise lingo of analytic philosophy en français and the precise lingo of the educational parlance. I mean, an entire socio-linguistic conference was organized around this. They haven't published it yet, the proceedings, but I had a keynote. And it was because of this. And it's in French, and I gave the talk in French because I learned the French that I learned in Tours, where they had this conference. But the problem is, you've got to have le mot juste, and I never have that because it's a translation. And of course, more recently, en politique prisée, le souci d'autrui, l'humanisme et les juifs, chez Heidegger. So there are 2 books that one can look at. One has to be kind, because of course, whenever someone is doing their best, they always fail. It's a result of trying too hard. The topic puts me where I am. I speak to you from the University of Winchester. I am in Winchester, England. I teach normally in New York City at Fordham University, but because of COVID, one is compelled to teach online. That means via Zoom. And I'm going to try and talk about what I call here new modes. I should also point out that this lecture in a different version will be appearing in Philosophy Today. So it is a text that is about to be published. It hasn't been published yet, but it will be. Whether that's good or bad, we will see. In the philosophy of technology, sometimes called the philosophy of technoscience, sometimes, there are a number of received, that's an important language in philosophy of science, and not so received names. These change, not only over time, but also depending on one's linguistic sensibilities. Thus, very important, the philosophy of technology is different in France. And French philosophy of technology has arguably, I would make the argument, contributed more than its fair share, which does not mean that all of its contributions have been honored across the academic, literary, and linguistic spectrum. In addition, and this is also important, there is the complex history of German and Dutch philosophy of technology, and there is also, as I shall note, a clear Swiss contribution, and so on, including Canadian and Australian and American thinkers, and so on, to quote Slavoj Žižek, we like saying, and so on, whom I also will be mentioning below. Add to this, and this makes it harder, the issue of time and reception. Who gets quoted, who does not? It is impossible to take account of all contributors as ultimately one should. This is where I spoke most of the French that I do speak, as one may add a Belgian name, Paul Otlet, enormously influential, even if his name doesn't happen always to be well known. In addition, crucially important, as it turns out, here is a sociological approach For Jean Baudrillard, the system of objects which last also adumbrates a philosophy of technology attuned to the subtle direction that is effected by design and outlined brilliantly. And there's our Swiss thinker, also to my mind, too little noted. Ah, yes, same point. Siegfried Gideon, mechanization takes command. That's published in 1948, and it was originally published not in French, but in English. Of course, 1948. Everything turns willy-nilly, and here's one of the very interesting things that Heidegger, when he turns to talk about technology, and technology is a mechanized system of the manufacture of corpses, might in fact have been reading, why not, he was in Freiburg, a little bit of Gideon. Everything turns willy-nilly all around. The one magazine article exploiting Otle, exploiting Gideon, I would argue, to take the lion's share of the credit, it's what Americans do, for a range of influences. To cite the title of Vannevar Bush, he is a relative of George Bush, both of them, as we may think, as well as the cybernetics mavens. There's the difference between the mimics and the mundaneum that was designed by Otle, and that's what Bush claimed. Now, Sloterdijk, if you read him, if you read the more boring parts of Sloterdijk, has already taught us this, and maybe also we learned it in school, and maybe we have forgotten some of these others. Here's more on the mundaneum. Fantastic, but I just love this, but it doesn't matter. Norbert Wiener and Warren McCulloch, and so on. Indeed, it can seem that one can hardly do better than chuck philosophy altogether, or almost, as one might think, switch to science fiction with Werner Winge, who lives in San Diego, and Tracy and I met him. He is the one who set the world on its still ongoing pursuit of the so-called singularity. That's his term. AI, which Nicolas already mentioned very insightfully in his discussion, the today's version of the singularity is deployed to track and to block tweets, suppress YouTube videos, predict patterns for new lockdowns, and along the way, just along the way, to deliver targeted ads to your internet browsing and help you log into your phone with face recognition. And face recognition only needs your eyes, which is why wearing a mask actually helps the machine to recognize your face. It makes it easier. If the machines are less than likely to ultimately wake up, the efforts to take AI in that direction have helped the wealthy find themselves enhanced via endocrinology, that's medical, and other new biotech, which is now very biotechnical, towards what we call transhumanism. As an obstacle in the way of that brave new world, we need a world cleared of carbon emissions to the extent that the little people can be induced to rebreathe. That's like a scuba machine diving apparatus. That means to re-inhale in the confines of their own masks, their own emissions, thereby neatly recycling their own CO2 whenever they leave the house, and maybe even, according to current directives, at home as well. Now, I have a long excerpt, which I'm not going to include because my name has been removed from this text. The Hannah Arendt Center apparently owns me, and I only knew that it was mine because I paid for that cartoon, which I think is a very important one. Mathematics, mathematics, scientific, scientific, then a miracle occurs. Mathematics, mathematics, etc. And Stanley Harris, beautiful line, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Now, I wrote that in order to write a book that is forthcoming in the next few months, Gunther Anders' philosophy of technology. What should always come first, and that's what I've just done, and I will try to do a little more of it because too little of it is done, is the naming of names. And all I'm doing is to note that some names are more important than others. Today, Gilbert Simondon is more received than the most comprehensive, in terms of all of his books, philosopher of technology, qua technological system par excellence, that would be Jacques Ellul. And it could have been, but it wasn't, Louis Bassot. But only Bachelard mentions him, no one else, not then, not since. So much for that. Scotosis. Today, we suppose that references to data, especially if it's a matter of tabulating PCR test results, note that the Techno system has subtly replaced cases of medical illness where one is literally or actually sick or ill with genuine symptoms that one might diagnose as symptoms. Remember what Heidegger tells us? It's his key example for hermeneutics. It is the most important example for hermeneutics. In the beginning of Sein und Zeit are signs as such, signs of what's going on in the organism, signs that must be read. But there has to be something wrong in order to read a sign of what is wrong. This is the hermeneutic techno-scientific key. Thus, it's relevant that Heidegger, who wrote his book in the literary penumbra of Thomas Mann's Zauberberg, the Magic Mountain, think Davos, as I am speaking to you from Winchester while thinking of Genf, as I think of it, and that means mountains, to be sure. Now, if thinking of analytic and continental philosophy in the context of Heidegger, we philosophers can tend to think of a certain encounter at Davos between two Kantians, obviously Cassirer here, and Heidegger. Cassirer was tall, Heidegger was short, very important to note, he was not tall. Two Kantians, they were both Kantians. It's because analytic philosophy points to this rupture. First, through, I think I have that there, yes, Michael Friedman, wonderful philosopher of science and Kantian, signally titled brilliantly, it's really an effort to talk about Carnap, A Parting of the Ways, along with, given the Black Notebook scandals like Cahiers Noir, a number of other revisitations of the same theme, Peter Gordon most recently. Because I know that some of you have begun to read Sein und Zeit, Being in Time, Lettre et le Temps, this past semester, current one, 2020, still ongoing, it's worth remembering that Heidegger wrote Being in Time, Sein und Zeit, in great part as inspired by Kant. Thus, Heidegger's Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics is itself an elaboration of the same lecture he gave in Davos, not to mention Heidegger's lecture courses, which weren't published. There are several of them, and also Die Frage nach dem Ding, all of them published, but except for Die Frage nach dem Ding and the Problem of Metaphysics posthumously, to the extent that we have notes for these. And one should underscore the hermeneutic dimensionality of his title. This is his course. This is the course Heidegger gave on his own work that then leads to Being in Time, phenomenological interpretation. Notice the hermeneutics there of Kant's critique of pure reason. And there's a great schematism quote here, en français, c'est ça, schematisme, very beautiful, that Heidegger quotes from Kant in that text. The reference to Kant is obvious from the title, Being in Time, but Heidegger's also phenomenologically attuned to the body. This complicates reading Heidegger immensely, hugely, from the side of both phenomenology and hermeneutics. Thus, there are elements of what was then for Heidegger known via Simmel is here, but also via Jaspers and Scheler, Max Scheler, he died too young, a matter of Existenzphilosophie and not less, but this was typically associated with Nietzsche, but also, of course, and given the legacy of the First World War, he lived forever, Ernst Jünger. Lebensphilosophie, Nomen est Omen. And it's just in this context that we remember what Heidegger tells us about those symptoms I just mentioned from Being in Time. And again, very literally, techno-science. To the same extent, hermeneutics is key to Being in Time, as well as being an indispensable prerequisite for reading what the narrator of Mann's The Magic Mountain, Zauberberg, tells the reader to read, and thereby to understand of the narrative revealed. Is Hans Karstorp the hero? That's Hans there. He's feeling his cheek. He's not giving him a PCR test. Just wanted to let you know. No, because that would be a little historical. Is Hans just opportunistically, as the story tells us, happening to be taking the opportunity to hop off to a spa, why not, Sabos, to visit his cousin, or is Hans in denial? I should add that if I give a hermeneutic reading of this novel, and I do, so too does Alexander at Princeton University, a friend of mine, also a friend of Tracy's. From an analytic perspective, the first chapter, you can check it out, of The Art of Living, via a parallel with Plato's Euthyphro, who also tells you one story and does something else. Plato does that a long time ago. For Heidegger, and I should say, given the current medical crisis, that I talk about this in a lecture I originally gave on Heidegger and health, and of course, Ivan Illich, at a 2016 conference in Quebec on nursing philosophy. There's a version online. Such symptoms as Illich writes about these, as Heidegger writes about these, may be indicative, to use Heidegger's language, of a trouble in the organism, or they may be a matter of light, external light, bad lighting, false positives, you could say, a result of emotion, exertion, which is part of what Thomas Mann writes. Who can tell? And even the doctors will order manifold diagnostic checks to check and cross-check and tests and procedures to interpret the results, or at least they used to. Now we just have one test. What causes a given symptom is still more complex as a question of etiology and philosophy of science, and Heidegger doesn't help us there. If a Polish serologist, that is to say, someone who is a specialist in blood and serum testing, with a bent for the history of infectious diseases, syphilis, really exciting sex disease, in particular, can aid us, one Ludwig Fleck, who wrote Entstehung und Entwicklung einer wissenschaftlichen Tatsache, 1935, The Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, and who, as a Jew and as a doctor, under the Nazis, also managed to use the hermeneutic indiscernibility, all of you Leibnizians should pay attention, of an anti-syphilis vaccine to deliver duds, he is making them there, to the officers who commanded the preparation of the serum from him and his colleague, Alexander Weigel. No one getting a vaccination can know just what is in the injection they are getting. That's how Fleck is able to oppose the Nazis. We may regard this in the spirit of the title of this lecture, Scotosis, as the first occlusion. After that, this is the challenge Pfizer and other companies currently face, and it's the reason that vaccine manufacturers demand to be indemnified or absolved in advance. If anything goes wrong, one can imagine our medical duo subtly battling the Nazis. There's a whole book on this. Dr. Fleck and Dr. Weigel, his conspirator, they had a conspiracy, would have welcomed such advanced exculpation, in their case, from negative or disabling consequences of the bad vaccines they gave on purpose. Today, much medical science is techno by default and design, adumbrated via computer assessment, like the PCR test itself, which is done by computers. And much biology, think the Human Genome Project itself, was not done using DNA. It was done doing combinatorics in a very, very, very large computer. Two computers fighting with one another to crack the code. It was not called a code for nothing. It's filtered through data analysis, as is physics and chemistry and so on. So much so that computational or information science arguably underlies both as metaphor and literal model. Think of the basis of lockdown, seemingly all the sciences today. If the environing world makes reference to milieu, an important one, Gilbert Simondon's broader schema of concretized milieu qua functioning ensemble, techno-geographic, is more marketable than the milieu I learned about in school, the milieu, intérieur, hacked out by the man who invented the word via brutal vivisection by Claude Bernard. This is his own dog he's experimenting on. That's why the dog, and that's why you still in medical experiments use household pets, because they trust you. The theorist who coined the term and invented the scientific practice. The link with automation is evident in the concept and the phantom of homeostasis. Now, I'm going to skip a certain section, which to me is important because I get to mention George Friedman, a very important thing, a whole bunch of other questions, few other references, which I'm not going to be mentioning. And I do want to mention Yukui because we'll come to him, the question concerning technology in China. Too complicated. One can say, why is she going on about all this? Too many names, too much information, too present, and too immediate. Thus, many opt to read recent books written by scholars who seem to have read no one. Tunnel vision is a calming thing, which is why we put blinders on horses in traffic. Heidegger is an excellent choice for you to look at, especially on the theme of technology, technoscience for Heidegger, who argues that technology antedates qua condition for modern science. This point I try to take up in reply to Nicolas' beginning remarks, but I'm not sure I will be fully capable of addressing them. Still, I think one really should go back to Ludwig Flack and his genesis and development of the scientific fact. Why? Because simply reading Flack, just reading him as a young researcher at Harvard in the library in Cambridge, Massachusetts, turned out to be enough to set the otherwise very conventionally, analytically minded Thomas Kuhn. He hated people's response to his book. He had no idea why he became so very famous for what he wrote there, because he hadn't written it, Fleck had. Kuhn had never heard, other than vaguely, of the complex sociology of knowledge, Mannheim and co., as Fleck knew this, as Gunther Anders, Heidegger's student, Scheler too, knew this as a phenomenological and not less hermeneutic socio-theoretic approach to reading and conceiving the history of a scientific fact like a disease entity. How do you figure out what syphilis is? It changes constantly. The cultural ideology of health informs Ivan Illich, and the very insightful and actually very brave Giorgio Agamben recommends that we maybe read him. He published ages ago, but most professional academics don't read him. We'll have a little trouble doing that. Why? Because the specialists in Illich have moved into the space of Illich's original thinking, which was the space of provocation, not convention. I've pointed out that cutting-edge scholars, the people who are important in the philosophy of technology, refer to little, if any, of the things I've just spoken about. The one downside, if you're ambitious, is that you have to pick, if you want to be on the cutting edge, the right cutting edge. Pick the wrong one, and your enthusiasms will languish. Here, note what I've done. I've used the word necropolitics. That's a safe choice in the era of coronavirus. In fact, it's been a safe choice for the last 5 years. The other bastard term in my title, the hyphenated Techno-Scotosis, needs perhaps some explication. Generically referring to intellectual blindness, what's important is that it's self-imposed. It bespeaks, and Nietzsche writes about this, and Plato writes about this, people who actually hate wisdom. A hostility to insight. As I learned, because in addition to being a student of Hans-Georg Gadamer, I was accidentally a student of Bernard Lonergan, the Canadian Jesuit author of a book, very big book, way too many lists, Insight. Here to illustrate, we can read the strangely contentless, a text written by, her subtitle is the title I'm stealing from her, The Necro-Political Grind. Natasha Lushitich makes it plain that she's reading Achille Mbembe, articulating Necro-Politics, that's translated brutalisme, which she explains as the management of death. For Kile Mbembe, she writes, who first coined the term, it's both the expression of sovereignty that resides in the power to dictate, that's a quote from Mbembe, who may live and who must die. High drama meets the everyday. She writes, automated micro-violence, little tiny things, comes closer to the mark, but doesn't quite capture the mysterious relationship between the situations, innocuous elements such as time, place, object, or digital platform. This can happen online, and action, and all of this, and all of this, and the necro-political grind they produce. I make elsewhere a related point. That's why I'm interested in what she writes, because it seems to me right, but it also echoes some of the things I think significant concerning the trivial play of tracking technology, as the COVID crisis makes it quite clear that GPS, your GPS signal, which you need to have in order to log into your computer, is about far more than finding a friend for the hour, as in Grindr, an app dedicated to finding those of a similarly minded, amorous inclination of the moment in terms of a far more generic and everyday presence at hand. Thus, if one can ponder the increased use, and you should have been thinking about it for the last, I'd say 10 years, in banking and university security of various double check secure logons, crucial for banking, what's certain is that how they work phenomenologically is as a means of ensuring that you have a cell phone, an assumption that might almost have been a given, but this is the most important thing, to train you by clicks and pings, and also by the inability to log in at the university, to keep your cell phone on or near your person. It's not enough to carry the cell phone or have it and leave it on your bedside. You've got to bring it with you. Always. This is also effected harmlessly at the same micro level of the same necro-political grind. Thus, track and trace works at a restaurant to connect you with every other diner passing through, even if they were there just before or just after you were there. Medical surveillance works for the sake of medical fascism. There he is. Quite as Ivan Illich argued some time ago, very important to pay attention to that second word, nemesis, and the X, which is also part of the key. In the Hallelujah Effect, I cite Slavoj Žižek. I said I'd get back to him, that's why I mentioned him, by quoting almost every time he uses vulgar language. I quote him at length. At his Minitel experience, an early version of the same grinder mentioned above, except for heterosexuals as well, qua funky old-tech plastic, rather than steampunk style, in keeping with the necro-political grind. You can look it up. Eric Allier cites it too. It's very blue. Worth citing if you're a Lacanian, the unconscious being structured as it is, like a language. By definition, the Hallelujah Effect as a phenomenon is all about entrainment and addiction. Like drugs, the joke can be varied. This is your brain on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. The 1998 movie, You Got Mail, written by Nora Ephron, starring Tom Hanks, and documenting the erotic subversion of the then AOL experience. This was done through a type of internet email profile that almost no one except people over 60 use anymore. I don't use it, but I have colleagues who do. Testifies to fair irrelevance, where am I? This is the quote. In the interim, by comparison with the larger profit phenomenon and profit margin of internet pornography, which is how everyone got addicted on all of this in the first place, or the even more comprehensive phenomenon of sexting, but also online dating, from hookups to marriage. Zizek, we all know this, got and kept his riffs by cursing. It's all talk. Cursing is an esoteric affair, as we know, even Alastair McIntyre, that's where that slide I was there, includes an exposition of the efficacy, it's an after virtue, and force of imprecation. The more vulgar the curse, the more extreme, the better it is. In his after virtue, in case you want to go tracking the reference, just look to the beginning of the chapter on the heroic virtues. There it is. It also works to prove genius. That's how you'll know. A verbal tick. I used to like to teach logic because it's not difficult to grade logic exams. Ad baculum. Genius requires ADD and attention-getting devices to boot. Thus, you may recall the non-cursing and utterly fictional Dexter. He who was, as we may remember if you liked watching, and I certainly did, a forensic blood spatter, that's what he's doing there, tracing where the blood would go, analyst in the employ of the Miami Police Department. And if we don't forget the importance of blood spatter for a variety of crime-related heroes on the law side of Law and Order, Rumpole of the Bailey, an emphasis shared in the case of private detectives by Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. I only mentioned Dexter because of his sister, Debra Morgan, played by Jennifer Carpenter in the pay television or cable series dedicated to Dexter, serial killer, ran from 2006 to 2013, the beautiful, fashionably and strangely thin, although she was supposed to be a cop, that makes it hard, foul-mouthed detective. She was killed off at the end of the series, so she's not going to be back in the they're doing it again. It's supposed to be out now, but it isn't yet because you don't know what's coming back in lockdown. Hollywood is slow too these days. The effect, connecting, the hallelujah effect, is the very efficacy of the sheer minimality, the micro thing that is feedback. Feedback's tiny, barely anything sometimes, nearly nothing at all still counts. Feedback is bare, hardly there, as sensitive to stimulus as a PCR test. Overkill for political effect and someone else's profit. This is cybernetics 101. This closes the circuit, registration, response. That's all we want. We want a tap and a response. That's it. It doesn't matter what it is. Could be keyboard, could be mouse clicks, could be haptic swipes, left, right. The haptic works best. Though Kittler points to sound, the pings. That too, it goes with our ears, is not apart from the haptic as such. We hear, we feel with our ears. The cybernetic is less about touch or feeling than connection. Having input anything, you tweet on Twitter, you got to go back to look if someone noticed. We wait for a registration confirming the same. Gunther Anders, father was a psychologist, him again, calls the dynamic homeworking, means you work 24/7 all the time, every minute of the day. Such that, and Cavelians could take note of this, we dedicate ourselves to radio, cinema, television, cable, TV, precisely enough to be able to identify references, like the references to You've Got Mail, or the Dexter allusion, fellow sports teams. Most men will know sports teams. Politics, most men will know this, Twitter, what have you. It is the same, ontologically immediate, no matter what we are doing. We are always connected with the screen. Those are the screens that are there. Now, in the Hallelujah effect, that's where that quote comes from. I argue that the checking activity, just looking to see if somebody said something on Twitter, reinforces the activity, because this mini event, this little tone buzz, is all the reward we get. And so advertisers have learned to their profit, as Twitter also knows, this is all we need. Now, more names, lots more names, tons more names I'm not reading now. So we just go, there's a lot of names. But I wanted to make sure to just have one tiny book, en français, Pasteur Guépé des microbes, Bruno Latour, where he talks about vaccines. In what follows, the second half of the paper, now I read Nietzsche, to situate Anders, Gunther Anders, born 3 years, 1903, after Nietzsche died in 1900, on the cusp of the technological transform, as Nietzsche writes of these as the premises, he calls them, of the machine age. In The Wanderer and His Shadow, apostrophizing the press. We have the quote here. You can read that in German if you like. That's what Nietzsche wrote, or in French. Trains and the telegraph as a conclusion extended over 1,000 years, the length of a Reich, accidentally, which logical conclusion Nietzsche claims no one, niemand, has yet dared to draw. Nietzsche had already announced his machine age in his most unread book. No one reads this book, even if they love Nietzsche. His first book, there announced as the terrestrial consonance. That is a literal deus ex machina, as he writes in The Birth of Tragedy. Weiha, nothing other than the Glaube an den Gott, der Maschinen- und Schmelztiegel. Right? This is, of course, in French, le Dieu des machines et des causes, along with eine Korrektur, and that's going to be the most important, the ability or the notion that wisdom itself or that science itself is capable of correcting or improving, rescuing the world. Convincing us at a blow, Nietzsche argues there, of the promise of an Erdenglück, that means happiness on this earth, which then displaces and upsets any hopes for a Jenseits. Why do you need the afterlife you have now? For his part, Anders wrote about radio. Actually, from the moment radio began, as about the acoustic phenomenon of broadcast sound and other ghosts of transmissions aspired and attained. So that's the next section. It's for Nietzsche, constitutive of the human, all too human character of our anthropo-epistemology to imagine, to believe that the limits of our perception, given whatever technological expansion one might wish, exhaust the limits of what there is. This is one of the reasons everyone objects to the idea of the noumenon in Kant. How could there be anything not in relation to us? It has to be phenomena all the way down, from the beginning of time to the depths of hell and the heights of heaven. Now, Nietzsche, of course, says the trouble is we change everything we see into our own picture, and that's a great problem, and we want to stay there. Nietzsche talks between our longing for what he calls immaculate perception, to know a world, and at the same time to exclude ourselves as knowers from the world, acceding to the view. Another tradition, that's the analytic tradition in philosophy, speaks of it. Down at NYU, I'm a little bit higher up at Fordham University, at Lincoln Center, from nowhere, the view from nowhere. Not only do we presume the universality of our view, but we presume that it's nowhere and that we can talk about that. We presume our invisibility. And is here, by contrast, and along with his cousin Walter Benjamin, thinks contemporary technological automation almost in the sense in which we speak of it today. I'm sorry, I didn't read that, but we have this here. There's Gunter. Sorry about that. Already, and this is a very long time ago, I was born in that year, 1956. His book on the antiquatedness, it's already in French, Obsolescence de l'homme, the Antiquität des Menschen. There's also a 1980 second volume that he writes. I have to say that it hasn't been translated into English, although it is in French, because my teacher when I was an undergraduate at Stony Brook, Don Idy, who's a philosopher of technology, said, there's no way that Anders will ever be in English. Well, a little bit of him is. Anders articulates today's quasi-Nietzschean all-too-human condition. We are outsiders, no one more than anyone else, equalized or leveled onlookers, spectators, captivated, standing outside by programs advertising the newest news, now at home, locked at home, along with the newest, latest gadget. Assuming our invisibility as we do behind our screens, focused on them as we are, we also manage to overlook what we technically know to be a given. This is our axiom today, more crucial than Frege's or Hilbert's concerns with the axiomatic Ansicht, ubiquitous surveillance. And given real time, I mentioned it before, real life contact tracing, almost every time you stop at a bar or a restaurant, already with everything you buy online and in person at the supermarket, this universal surveillance adumbrates what the sociologists Michael and Katina Michael down in Australia some time ago described as Uberveillance, with soon-to-be mandated universal vaccination complete with quantum dots in imprint like cattle, and nanobits infused into the GMO organisms, I'm just quoting Bill Gates, injected directly into your veins, just quoting Gates. This new biosurveillance will be constant, including every breath you take. Please take your breaths under your mask to ensure that you do your part to reduce those CO2 by recycling or re-inhaling. It's for everyone's sake, after all. I have a lot of stuff I'm skipping, which means there'll be a slide out of purpose, and that's all right. As Nietzsche and Adorno and Anders have told us, what we like is what we recognize. We need to know it. Combined with the transient urgency of responding to this in real time, the sooner the better, all inspiring seemingly equal insider claims to be an outsider. For Anders, gadget envy, to the World Health Organization, your new vaccine, which puts you on a track to need a second and a third, you're going to need booster shots and so on, until the real-time experiment, which is what we're doing in biopower, plays itself out and delivers the data the government needs. They actually need the DNA they didn't have. They just did it with computers to begin with via computer simulation. So the tests for COVID have been a boon to those seeking massive samples of human DNA. So tricky to acquire in sufficient abundance until now, and the vaccine schema to follow, and the schedule of updates again needed again and again. And if you doubt this, you can think of Microsoft and Apple and your cell phone carrier and everything else that requires constant updates and you have to shut down until they're installed. Gadget envy, that's Anders' term, has somehow been replaced with the call for universal mandatory masks and a call, people want this, universal mandatory vaccine passports, now replaces the over-eager adolescence ambition that was almost 2,000 years ago a morality tale for the 2nd century in the Christian culture, you could say, Lucian, telling the story of mystery cults and roses and transmogrifications that could turn a boy into an ass, a donkey, and absent a reset, and without turning him back again, the Pinocchio story reverses the account. So too the mechanical mystery dolls of the tales of Hoffmann. Goethe's Sorcerer's Apprentice is cut from the same cloth. Okay, now I'm going to skip this just to go to this in the interest of time. There was stuff, but we'll just go to the next point. It's no accident that the phenomenon of ghosting, that's the word there, is an artifact of the texting platform. That's when people you're having sex with or not having sex with via texts suddenly decide not to answer your texts. That's ghosting. It's a leftover, the same language, trace, echoing the CRT screens of yesteryear, which haunts LCD monitors and HD TVs. The current phenomenon is a metaphor, ghosting. It's not burned. It's not a trace that's real. It's projected into the real world where you can be canceled or, of course, mobbed. The negative claim we're talking about happened to Agamben when he dared to say anything to question the lockdown in Italy. It's often studied at the highest level of academia, which doesn't stop, that is to say, its technical term, academics from mobbing other academics, as is witnessed by the intellectual assaults that we already saw, and which we keep on seeing every time he publishes something new on Agamben. And all Agamben did was raise a question, which you're not supposed to do. In philosophy, the same mobbing mechanism drives the analytic continental divide, as it also accounts for validation, most obvious when withheld. This was the case with respect to Anders, and this is the issue of his lack of reception, quite to the extent that in general, the phenomenon permeates philosophy of technology, where Anders should be central and where he is almost not at all. Now, more stuff, not here, not here, not here, not here. We do not do that. We will not read it. We will not. No. None of it, none of it, none of it, none of it. We skip ahead. Unfortunately, here, elsewhere, in a popular context, I write about the phenomenon of locative feedback I steal from Greg Milner, accidentally upending the punch of Ludwig Wittgenstein's map ponderings forever because you are the blue dot. Not so fast, we might reflect. Using GPS and a mapping app on a smartphone or tablet presents you with you, located as a little pulsing blue dot. Not the red dot, the blue dot. If Wittgenstein's orienting problem persists, it's resolved by the same circuit of feedback, input, response, like Pokemon Go, which people may have played a couple of years ago. The cybernetic feedback looping includes an echo of one's physical motion on the screen. You're often twice on your own screen, not just by accident. And so GPS exemplifies the Chinese phenomenologist Yucui's and not less Heidegger's, Yucui is just the most recent name, but also Jacques Ellul and also Latour, who wrote about this as well, and their observations concerning automation. But this only works as part of a hermeneutic system. You need to read your map, and this reading is performance practice in action. If you want to use your GPS map or Google map, you have to walk a few yards. You've got to move. The feedback is, and this is generally, and if not always true, close to instantaneous. The tracking effect, this isn't an accident, is suitable for a military application. It has military precision. The blue dot moves on the screen, and we know where we are, oriented toward whatever destination we have in mind. My concluding reflections on technology and war return to this, maybe. Dot being, which I like to call it, comes in colors. The blue, innocuous enough. The red dot, you really don't want to be the red dot, not so much. And with RoboCop remakes, Eye in the Sky and Blade Runner reboots as due warning, that's, of course, once again, where we are left. There are only two brief notes to conclude. We will call Nicolas' poster for the talk. Penultimate reflection, insecurities, or what now? What then? Quite apart from the right-wing tendencies of the assimilations of Nietzsche to transhumanism, there are numerous discussions of Nietzsche and technology, including the digital Dionysus, typically drawing on Kittler's kind of homeopathic, he barely mentions it, reference to Nietzsche's Molling-Hansen brass typing ball, as depicted in gramophone film typewriter, duly explicated, I quote Kittler, as a model, because it was a model. Important to say, because Nietzsche's device barely survived use and travel. He used it like once or twice. It's like some things we get from Amazon, use once or twice and then never again. And just where crushing, the least crushing, obviously you can see how risky that would be, rendered it as useless as some of the so-called daisy wheel printers, which were, however, more at the mercy of lost or misplaced printhead. They were flat and so they were safer. It'd be incorrect to claim that today's inkjets are less vulnerable to handling or damage or clogging. But when our print cartridges die or our printers seize, we take the limitations of the medium in stride. We learn to clean printheads or pay a premium and inevitably replace the printer itself at some programmed interval dictated into the machine by the manufacturer. I have a whole thing about Tracy and Carl Schmitt right here, but I'm not going to read it because he says he doesn't want me to. So we'll just skip that. And also it's way too long, way too long, way too long. We're going to go to the next section. There's also a little bit on Patrick Lynn, who was paid to write this, Ethics of Hacking Back, 6 Arguments from Armed Conflict to Zombies. He's an analytic philosopher. Analytic philosophers get away with that. Necropolitical postscript, where I am, or technology. We have found the enemy, and he is us. Nous avons rencontré l'ennemi, et c'est nous. Very fine, all right. The title of Rosa Brooks, I think I have a slide for that. How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything is a well-known story, which requires constant retelling. Today's digital technology, beginning with the popular computer and what becomes the internet, is related. It is only because of military innovation. This is the connection, as Sloterdijk emphasizes this, as Kittler emphasizes this, and as I cite this in a recent discussion of Anders, who makes a similar point on radio ghosts, because it's the Nazis beat everyone to it, for the co-evolution of radio and aviation, planes and bombs. If the scheme for a global library, that's where I started, we go back to where we start at the end, goes back to our Belgian librarian, Paul Otlet, developing with his mondaneum old household technologies. It's actually Renaissance technology for reading several books at one time, only projected to a Corbusier scale, rotating manuscript wheels dating from the Italians. They are very, very good with their design. Today's support for deployment on national and international scales goes back to this, co-opted, as we saw at the start, by Vannevar Bush's 1945. He already had that there. You don't really have to wait for the Google eyes or vision, as Vannevar Bush already said, as we may think. Media archaeological analysis could be very worthwhile if only the archaeology in question can break the limits of today's conventionalities, not only where Kittler reminds us of the complexity of the development of portable typewriters and the gender transformation of clerks from male to female personnel. He writes about this in his gramophone film typewriter, but also psychology in all its forms, as Kittler emphasizes. The point is more material than one may suppose from the language of psychological strategies. It can be useful to note the Scottish performance practice. Steve Goodman, I hope to get back to that, sonic warfare, for a sense of the contemporary projects corresponding to this long-standing habit of American military inventiveness. A couple of movie examples. Noting the hermeneutic phenomenology needed to talk of today's technology, one of the main themes of the Hallelujah effect underlines that mind control is not something out of a B-movie or even a cult film like Vertigo or Gaslight. It's a straightforward affair or effect of programming, or psyops, you could say, as the military named this. The military likes to call it that, or just call it social engineering. That's what Facebook calls it. From the beginning of what Horkheimer and Adorno, they analyzed this in 43 and again in 47, call the culture industry. The calculated military deployment of this crystallization technique was deployed from the start by government and corporate culture. There's also a text nobody reads and everyone should read, Culture and Technology, about the programmed pre-planning of the atomic bomb in media. That's all it's about. Bertolotti shows that one can conceal things in plain sight, and Bertolotti uses the efficacy of journalism and print, includes reproductions, which can, this is a matter of accommodation and timing, make them effectively invisible in the same news media in which they appear. Juxtaposition of news items, rate and timing of publication. Anders points this out, Adorno points this out, Baudrillard points this out. In every case, one has no response. In an age of climate change, this has to be parsed as man-made by various means, some incidental, some as a result of human intervention and activity, and some quite deliberate matters of weather control. The lesson, we're back to Lucian again, from Apuleius to Goethe to Anders, and Anders likes this example and likes to remind us of this. This is a caution that we all two human beings will not stop until, this is the Peter and the Wolf problem, this is the Sorcerer's Apprentice problem, aka Harry Potter. It's the same story updated for the Brits. And this is every disaster movie ever made until we have set the disaster in motion. And even then, we will not stop. We neither know what we do, nor were we capable of knowing our actions, can we anticipate the negative consequences of those acts, even when the negatives are blatantly tragedy of the commons, simplistically obvious, we fail to see it. The philosopher Peter Singer can give utilitarian reasons why, as can negative economic theorists like Lester Thoreau, assuming Heidegger and Anders and Sloterdijk might somehow not be your cup of tea. The Scotosis, that is the techno-blindness, is here to stay. And that's the conclusion. So I'm going to stop sharing. and we can maybe ask some questions and you can show me where I'm wrong.